and then I'm going to let these kids in.
If we're watching this informative, I'm going to walk around. It's outside the chamber. She's on the plaza where she was on January 6th, and the Capitol.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming. If you could just go ahead and mute your mic, that your name is your name as listed on the participants. That way we can make sure we're marking everybody correctly when you register. And make sure you guys all get your classical credits. Hope everybody is having an amazing Tuesday. Thank you guys for joining us again.
And Valerie, I can just let me know when I can start.
Absolutely. We'll give everybody just another moment to kind of get in. Got a few more folks coming in through the waiting room.
Okay, sure.
Thank you guys for joining us again. I know some of you guys got the email yesterday chatting about the classical certificate and the courses. I saw a few of you guys respond. I'm happy to get those sent right over so you guys can start tracking what you've completed. If you guys have any further questions about the classical certificate, feel free to email me anytime. And just to make sure your names do show the person who is attending today. That way we can just make sure we're marking it correctly. If it's a few people in your office attending, go ahead and just send me an email with who is participating today.
And then so Valerie, a lot of the students here are recurring. I'm assuming that some people, this might be the first class they've attended. Is that right?
We had a few new registrants.
Okay.
Okay, Jay, I think you are good to go.
Okay, well, everyone, welcome. My name is Jay Cantrell. I'm a teacher. I teach modern architecture at UT Arlington, and I teach classical architecture here at the ICAA, and I love both realms. I think I'm just going to kind of quickly go over some of the stuff we talked. I know there's some new members. So the first couple of images are going to be drawings done by several members of the ICAA and also philosophers, historians. And we're just going to do a quick little regroup in case you're not familiar with some of the other classes. This is called Characteristics of the Classical Orders. And I think you can see the PowerPoint lecture as identified primarily by first century architect Vitruvius. Vitruvius was an extraordinary individual. He pretty much codified, discussed, and drew really the classical orders that were really originated by the ancient Greek citizens. So in other words, the characteristics means what is, Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. What are the characteristics of those orders? These are, and I'd like you to keep a notebook and a sketchbook. These are important to write down. The Tuscan order is probably the simplest one. Smith will look at these in a minute. The Doric order is identified by Vitruvius as the masculine order. Ionic is the feminine order, primarily because of the volutes. Corinthian is very decorated. We'll talk about that. And delicate, primarily because of the acanthus leaves. And the composite is a mixture. And don't hesitate to tell me if I'm going too fast. I have a habit of getting carried away, but I love classical architecture. These are some really wonderful elements and things to kind of study. So the next image is, let's kind of write this down in our book. These are really very important dates for the orders because I think a lot of people think that all the classical orders were established at the same time, and they actually were not. The Tuscan is really the oldest order, 900 BC. Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, those came probably several hundred years later, but they weren't all created and designed at the same time. And a lot of the orders were designed and created to commemorate battles, new emperors, new citizens, new commemorative people. in the Greek societies back then. So we're talking about the difference between all, they're actually 5 orders. And then in the class, we're going to talk about characters. This is characters of, or characteristics of each one of the orders. Who was Vitruvius, which we talked about? Who was Callimachus? Okay, so moving right along, Vitruvius was a first-century architect. He's really the one that discovered the writings of, actually, this is drawn by Leonardo da Vinci, but it's reinstated by Vitruvius because Leonardo was able to get some of Vitruvius's notes and draw that the center of the human body and man's center of nature was really in this diagram. So Vitruvius is really responsible for creating this diagram. This, of course, is redrawn by Da Vinci. This is not Vitruvius's original drawing because it doesn't exist anymore. But really, we're looking at Leonardo's drawing originally created by Vitruvius, the first-century architect. So again, just a kind of quick overview of the classical orders. There's really the very preliminary orders, the basic ones, Doric, Ionic, Corinthians, established by the ancient Greeks. Then, of course, during the Renaissance, they've added 2 to make the 5 formulas: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. So the Tuscan Order is the oldest one, roughly 900 AD, which we can see the primitive wooden Tuscan Doric hut or temple that was established way before Greek societies. In the Renaissance, they discovered that the Tuscan Order was older than Doric and Corinthian, and of course, then Composite was introduced in the Renaissance. So we're just going to quickly look through the drawings first, and we'll talk about each order specifically, and what characteristics, and what do we mean by characteristics. Again, some of our earlier lectures, I know you guys have seen this before, but really each order has all of these, I'm calling them 4 basic parts: the column, shaft itself, the structural member, the post, and of course the entablature, which is comprised of 3 members: the architrave, the frieze, the cornice. Pretty much every order has this basic structure. I hope I'm not kind of repeating myself, but it's important to know this for people that are just entering the class. So pretty much this nomenclature is established during each one of the orders. And then what I was saying in the lecture the last couple of weeks is that pretty much every little piece of this is proportioned and based on the diameter of one of the columns in the orders. So again, to repeat myself, if you look at this, Tuscan is 7 diameters tall. The height is determined by the number of diameters. Doric is 8, Ionic is 9, and then Corinthian and Composite are 10 diameters tall. It's really hard to mix these together because each order has its own specific height and its own proportioning system based on the diameter of the column. Okay, so there's really one place, I think you've seen the Parthenon in ancient Greece. The Erechtheum in Athens is a small little asymmetrical temple, but it really has all of the orders in one building from ancient Greece: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. It doesn't have Tuscan or Composite because those were added later in the Renaissance. And these are just some very primitive pictures. You can see that it's a little bit contradictory that because, classical architecture is primarily symmetrical, about a central axis. The Erechtheum is a smaller temple next to the Pantheon, the Parthenon in ancient Greece. You can see that all the 3 orders are there on the facades. And the only sort of order, this is actually not one of the orders, but you've seen that the ancient caryatids in ancient Greece, those are actually servants for some of the gods in each one of the temples. But of course, they're not technically classified as an order. We can see they are structural columns that hold up the entablature. So I'm showing this because this is one building where you can see all the classical orders from ancient Greece in one building. Okay, so just let's kind of loosely look at the Tuscan Order. It's technically, according to Vitruvius, the simplest order. There's no fluting in the columns. There's no Ionic capitals. You can see the crispness and the clarity in just the particular order. Of course, the Ionic Order has the classical volutes, and of course the fluting. The fluting are the curves and plan, and of course the verticals that actually accentuate the verticality of the column. Then, of course, the Corinthian order has what's called acanthus leaves. This is a very, very complex order, probably the most decorative of all the orders out of the 3 or 5 basic ones. On the left, you can see that there is a method of drawing these things without the actual leaves on it. So if you look at the bar graph on the left or at the top, is that each one of these little parts is relative to the dimension or the diameter of the column. So if you look at the diagram on the right, is that each sort of capital has at least 2.5 or 3 rows of acanthus leaves. We'll talk about the acanthus flower and plant in a minute. Then, of course, the composite order, probably classical architecture's most exuberant and elaborate order because it's mixing Ionic order with the volutes and, of course, the acanthus leaves from the Corinthian order. You can definitely see that there's a mixture of Ionic and Corinthian in the same order. So originally in the Corinthian order, the little tendrils are much smaller, very tiny volutes. In the Renaissance architecture, primarily because of Palladio and then Scamozzi. Scamozzi was Palladio's scholar that finished a lot of his work after he passed away. But you can see that you can clearly see the mixture of the other orders coming into the play in this particular order. So again, the Tuscan order is the smoothest and simplest one. So let's kind of break down the parts of the Doric order, either Greek or Roman orders. And I've shown some photographs and examples of how these things are actually carved and created. If you look at Greek Doric, you can see that the columnar capital is more exaggerated with an elliptical profile. When we get to Roman Doric order, they're compressed and not quite as elliptical. So if you look at Roman Doric, you can see the capitals actually are more curvilinear and less elliptical. If you can see my cursor where the capital is that the curves are much less exaggerated and a little bit simpler than some of the other ones we've seen before. Then I'll have you write some notes in your sketchbook in a minute. So let's take a look at the Doric order. This is Greek Doric. You can see that really the capital itself is a transition part between the beam and, of course, the column. So the capital is a large piece of molding that articulates the joint between the capital and the actual column shaft. So let's go back to that for just a minute. The Doric order really has what's called the triglyphs and the metopies. I think you can see there's the word called triglyph. But triglyph is really in the wooden temples. They're abstracting in stone and marble the actual wooden beams that would be the short ends of the beams on the actual frieze. So in other words, the little 3 parts are actually the stylized beams that are either in stone and marble that are actually telegraph the beams on the facade of this temple. Of course, the metopy at the left is a space between the 2 triglyphs, which have, of course, primarily animal carvings in each one of these pieces. So the Doric order really shows the triglyphs and the metopies. So in the Greek temple, this is a more stylized version of the ancient Etruscan temple, which uses wood. What I was showing you earlier in the classes is that they're taking the wooden temple and reconstructing these in stone and marble. So what we're looking at is the 3 wooden beams that would be the structure of course, the temple's roof. Again, the architrave is the structural beam that spans between the columns. Arch, the prefix means chief or highest order. The largest, most important beam, of course, is called the architrave. You can see that here. The architrave is the main beam between the 2 columns. The frieze is the span above that, but between the cornice and, of course, the architrave. So what they're doing well, In Greek and Roman architecture, they're taking the Etruscan temple and stylizing that in stone and marble. But you can see here, of course, you can obviously see the fluting of the columns are these vertical ribs that emphasize the verticality of the columns. Let's go back to that image in just a minute. So again, you know, the Greek or Roman Doric after, actually right before the Renaissance, is that the columns were much more compressed and simplified versus some of the other ones we've seen before that. But what I was going to show you is really the Doric order telegraphs the ancient Etruscan temple on the facades. You can definitely see, if you can see my cursor, is that the wooden beams from the Etruscan temple are stylized in marble and stone on the architrave here. Again, this diagram is showing you that the Etruscan temple on the left is showing you the wooden temple in the structure, and then on the right, they're stylizing all the parts into a stone and marble vernacular. So in other words, triglyphs means 3 wooden beams on the right, which of course we can see the wooden beams from the Etruscan temple there on the left. So in this diagram, we can see the architrave is really comprised of 2 wooden beams that span the space between the columns. Of course, on the right, we're stylizing this in stone and marble. So in other words, in Corinthian or Ionic, you would not see the triglyphs and the metopes expressed on the wall. It's really this, the Doric order has these elements. Okay, so then in the Ionic order, we can see the fluting, we can see the volutes. The volutes are not arbitrarily created. There's a very systematic way of proportioning and drawing each one of the curves. This is an ancient Grecian Ionic Capital. You can see the careful craftsmanship of the sculptor in each one of these volutes. This is a great picture of showing the actual construction techniques. You know, of course, they're not building with steel or iron. They're actually using stone to construct everything. You can see that the Ionic Capital is comprised of what used to be probably tapestries scrolled around together to make the Ionic volute. And the way you would actually draw this is, if you look at this diagram, there's an engraving showing how what this square little rotated 45-degree angle is showing you that the locations of the radii, how you actually draw the curve to spiral consecutively to make it smaller or larger. There's a very careful, systematic way of showing these. You can obviously see the flutes, which are very classic verticality that express the verticality in the columns. Now, there's a lot of speculation about what the original Ionic orders used to look like. A lot of reconstruction historians are kind of assuming that they're polychromed in gold leaf with different colors and different materials. It's incredible to think that, you know, with very primitive tools, they were able to make and create these very sophisticated polychromed images or, you know, sculptures. I mean, these are just beautiful pieces of art themselves. Of course, now we're really seeing them as just the pure stone and marble, but I think originally they were probably gold leaf and painted. Now, what this is showing you, this is actually, I think this is one of the earlier temples that uses the Ionic order. What I'm showing you is this, you can see the construction because a lot of people think that the columns are just carved out in one piece, which is very challenging physically and economically to do that. But you can see that some of the columns are made of these individual drums, much easier to construct than actual carving out of one column out of one piece and installing it and constructing a temple. But you can see that there's probably a large wooden column that's inserted to keep the alignment of the column in place. But I mean, look at the fact that chisels and hands can carve the flutes out. There's probably 24 concentric rings around the column just to articulate that. Here's a large detail of the base. And the base is not, on some of these, is not just smooth, but there's really intricate carvings to articulate the way the column meets the base plinth of the platform. Okay, so we're moving on to Corinthian. Let's kind of keep our questions at the end of the lecture, because I want to make sure we go through all the orders. The Corinthian Order, there's a wonderful story, absolutely beautiful creation as an artist or a sculptor. I've mentioned this before, but it's comprised of what's called the acanthus leaf. It's a leaf or a plant that grows naturally in ancient Greece. Look at that in just a minute. If you look at this, it's even more sophisticated than some of the earlier orders because, of course, the capital is actually concave. It's even more difficult to construct than the earlier Doric or Ionic Corinthians. The left diagram is showing you how you actually draw and construct the column before the leaves were added. Here's a beautiful watercolor. I think this might have been drawn either from Robert Adams' office or Piranesi's drawing studio. But you can see clearly the acanthus leaves are adorning the column capital. This is actually an excerpt from the 4 books of architecture by Palladio. He actually manually drew each one of the orders. There's a list of bibliography at the end of the lecture, and I think I've included that in a PDF from the last lectures, but you can definitely see the leaves are adorned around the column's capital. But so what do we mean by the acanthus leaf? Where does that come from? Oh, I'm sorry, this slide is not that clear. But Callimachus was a sculptor. The story is he was walking by the grave of a young girl's funerary basket. And what's happening, he was walking by here, he saw that the ashes were sitting on top of the roots of an acanthus leaf. Of course, it gave birth to the acanthus plant that started growing around the basket. It's a very poetic, romantic way of creating this columnar. I'm not sure if this was really the story, but you know, in ancient Greek and Roman times, there were some wonderful poetic stories about the way these capitals were created. But of course, that's a story, and that's the sculptor romanticized and engraving, probably drawn by the late great Piranesi. But you can see that the evolution of the acanthus plant on the capital is, of course, creating this column. And you have to kind of think about the fact that here's actually the plant, not the most beautiful plant in the world of landscaping and architecture or horticulture, but of course, the leaves themselves have a certain architectonic quality. So what you're looking at is the sculptor took the leaves and carved them out of the stone or the marble. And this must have been an extraordinary sculptural feat to do this because, of course, Callimachus was taking a solid block of stone or marble and cutting this out of one piece. Not only is it a challenge in sculpture, but the fact that this is one block, you'd have to subtract all the mass out to make for the negative space. This is just an extraordinary sculptural feat. And again, these were originally not built for people. These were temples built for gods. So the largest, most elaborate temple, the most elaborate carving would, of course, be celebrating the gods. And this is a time in culture where they thought a lightning storm was punishing the citizens of ancient Greece. So the largest, most elaborate and exuberant structure of the temple was probably the best one, but this is just extraordinary work. I was going to show you is, you know, these are Corinthian capitals on, of course, the Pantheon in the 1st century AD in Rome. What you're looking at is, of course, the Corinthian Order. You can see the capitals from the acanthus leaf, the architrave, the frieze, the cornice at the top. But the reason I'm showing this is because these columns are carved out of one piece. In other words, they would have to take an enormous size of stone and marble and cut this out of one piece. And then, of course, the capitals are constructed out of another separate block. So then the round part, which is the astragal that marries the joint between the capital and, of course, the shaft, is expressed here on the curve. So let's take a look at that. How would they honestly, and I think these are columns from marble from Egypt. So they had to transport the columns from Egypt to Rome. How would they do this? Of course, you can't transport columns vertically on a ship. They have to be laid horizontally. So I'm showing you is probably a reconstruction drawing. This is actually scaffolding drawing. You would lift the obelisks in Rome from Egypt, probably the same sort of construction method to raise each one of these columns in place in person. And there's hundreds of these columns. It's just amazing to think that with primitive societies, they were able to construct these things without power tools, backhoes, bulldozers. The reason I'm showing this is because if you go back to my original slide, is that it's easier to construct columns as individual drums or parts. But we're looking at here is definitely something very different than that. And it's just amazing to think that people can, can carve and build things in this sort of, vernacular like that. This is an early, I think this is a temple of Hera, one of the early, probably Ionic Order temples, probably roughly about 600 BC. But a lot of people say, well, did these temples really exist like that? Well, you can see, look at the construction method for each one of the columns. And one person, well, not one person, but there are probably hundreds of sculptors, carvers, cutting out each one of these blocks. And I love the fragment of the Ionic flute. They're just, excuse me, hanging off of one of the drums of the columnar orders there. I think this is our last image. It's almost 12:30. Is going to show you that this is Bernini's colonnade. It's the Tuscan Order. It's the simplest order. But what you're looking at is originally the plan. This is Bernini in Baroque architecture. The plan of these columns were elliptical. This is the first time we've seen elliptical columns in architecture. In other words, what's happening is they were so difficult and expensive to construct as ellipses that, of course, I'm sure the Pope at the time convinced Bernini to carve them just out of round columns. So what you're looking at is that for budget cuts, they had to make these columns round, not elliptical in plan, but they're still extraordinary pieces of sculpture. Okay, I went over a lot of information in about 30 minutes. We can take a break for questions and comments. And Valerie, I think you can probably tell me what sort of questions some of the students have.
Yep, I am watching the chat. Feel free to unmute your mic so you guys can ask questions, or if you guys want to type into the chat, I'm happy to ask it for you.
What's interesting is, I'm sure that you have a question, but in this diagram is you're seeing that really the triglyphs and metapieces we express only in the Doric order. You really don't see that in Ionic and Corinthian or composites.
Lisa would like to know if you'll be showing local examples that we can study.
Local examples, you mean local in terms of architecture in Dallas, or?
I think we have some folks from Dallas, Houston,
Okay.
and San Antonio, Austin area, as well as a couple folks from California. I can possibly get with our California team to create some of those examples.
Yeah, of course. I can send them, I can send them a PDF of some examples, if that would help.
Yeah, we can include that in the next round of attachments that I send out.
Yeah.
And then the next question was, how were the drums from which columns were constructed kept aligned vertically? The columns in the Temple of Hera look very tall. How do they not topple?
That's a good question. Let's go back to that image. I think you're talking about this image or the ones that I showed at the last image. She's talking about this one. Excellent question. Is this the right slide?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Can you guys see my cursor? Oh, can you see there's a little square cut out in the center of the columns? Can you guys see that? And now this, they didn't have steel. They had to, of course, this is, way beyond the Bronze Age. They did have iron. So what happens to keep the columns from toppling, there was probably a large iron rod that was inserted at the center to keep the column, well, I'm calling the drum, to keep the column shaft aligned exactly at the center. So what you're looking at is there's a little square. Let me go back to this image, this one. You can see the square. That was probably either a wood or an iron vertical strap to keep all the columns aligned. So that's why it's technically a structural. Remember, it's not, we didn't have steel, but that's really to keep the columns vertically aligned with each other. That's a good question. It's just unbelievable to think that these didn't collapse. I mean, this probably collapsed due to an earthquake, not because it was structurally a failure, but for natural disasters. But what you're looking at is a little key to make sure either a large wooden post or iron, probably to keep these all aligned and so they don't just sort of collapse and fall over. So. Now, if wood is buried in where there's less oxygen, the wood can sustain itself because it's not exposed to oxygen, so where it can rot. Okay, and does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, okay. I'm sure there's many others. Originally I was going to section this into 30 minutes of lecture, 30 minutes of drawing, but I think we're not going to have enough time to actually do drawings. I think we can just entertain questions. And if there's an interest in combining the next lecture I can lecture for maybe 15 minutes at the beginning, and then we can do a drawing tutorial for 45 minutes. I'm willing to do that for our next lecture for next Tuesday, if there's an interest to do that.
We have another question. Would the simpler styles be used for less important buildings? Was there a hierarchy with how the orders were used?
That's a good question. I think that is a good question. If you look at Tuscan Order, you probably would not see, well, that is a good question because let's take a look at the Tuscan Order. You would not see this order used for probably large, probably the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. probably has Corinthian orders because Corinthian is probably the most decorated and celebrated order. But then again, if you look at something as monumental, let me scroll down, as Bernini's Colonnade. This is probably one of the most famous, most important buildings in Europe. And the Colonnade is its simplest order. You would think that Bernini would have used Composite or Corinthian. But then again, if you look at the facade of St. Peter's, there are Corinthian capitals because, of course, the hierarchy is that it's probably the most important basilica in Rome. But then you have to think about aesthetic value. So let's take a look at if Bernini would have added Corinthian or composite capitals in the colonnade. Look how overdone and somewhat wedding cake that entire piazza would have looked like with all those Corinthian capitals. So I think it's probably due to both hierarchy and an aesthetic decision. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's a very good question about the hierarchy. I think it depends on the emperor, the president, the architects. Yeah. Now, again, composite order is really for very tall, larger buildings. If you look at Palladio's scholar, Scamozzi, that finished a lot of his work, a lot of Palladian buildings were very tall and massive. So I think the composite order was there just to kind of celebrate the size of the buildings. But that is I'm not sure I answered that. That is a good question.
Yes.
Okay. And if anyone wants to, I can go back and pause the slides if you want to sketch them or take notes in your sketchbook. I just thought that the dates were interesting because a lot of people think that if you look at this one, that all the orders were comprised in one setting. Well, obviously, this is the earliest order on the left, the Doric or Tuscan. Then later, they became more elaborate. If you think about this, really the capital itself is simply a transition piece between the beam and of course the columnar shaft. So several hundred years later, many different orders, they get more elaborate. You know, it's also interesting that we actually have the sculptor's name, Callimachus, because architects and sculptors really weren't celebrated like they are in the Renaissance or in classical times in antiquity. There's only a few names of architects that we have in, excuse me, in the ancient world.
Hi, this is Raphael from Houston.
Yes.
This may have already been covered, but my power went out momentarily, actually.
Okay.
But could you talk about which orders would be considered Greek orders and where the transition happens to more Roman orders?
Yes, I have to let me upload a different PDF, and because I'll have to kind of scroll out for just a minute. Yeah, let me change my screen over and
And then Jay, let me know when you're ready for the next question.
okay, hold on. Yeah, I'm just looking for that image. Okay, and let me change my screen again, and let's see here. Okay, and so Valerie, can you see where it says comparative Greek and Roman orders?
Yes, sir.
You know, it's a really hard question to answer in just a few seconds, but if you look at these, there's a mixture of, if you look at the chart, Greek Doric, if you look at the left one, it's the fattest column, it doesn't have a base, but I think the Romans sort of articulated and kind of refined the Grecian language of the classical orders. You can see there's definitely some different variation between the Greek, Doric, Ionic, and Roman. I know this chart is a little bit confusing to read, but what I was showing you earlier is that if you look at, let's take a look at Greek Ionic. You can you see my cursor where it says looking up?
Yes.
Okay, so what you're looking at is a plan of the columns looking up at the capitals underneath. So the Greeks probably had, in other words, the volutes horizontally vertical facing. Then the Romans were able to establish the 45-degree diagonal for the corners. So pretty much Greek Ionic columns would have been flat. Roman would have been more, if you can see, the 45-degree angle between the volutes that address the 45-degree diagonal. But it's hard to kind of explain it in just one image because there's so many different variations. I'm sure they took the ancient Greek orders and kind of refined them. And what I was saying is the last lecture is that if you look at the column on the left that says Greek Doric, you know, this is probably 600, 700 BC. So at this time, they really weren't able to maximize the structural integrity and minimize the material. So the early temples have very, very fat columns. Later in Roman Doric and Ionic, they were able to maximize the structure and minimize the material, which means I would be able to structurally make the columns thinner. So I think the Roman orders are probably thinner and taller than the Greek orders, because if you think about Roman architecture, is that the society was getting larger and more people, the buildings became larger, so the orders became larger, and of course the structure was more carefully engineered. That's a good question to ask and a hard question to answer. But I think that might give you some insight about the two different relationships. And honestly, since I've been teaching in class for the last 2 months, I've been looking for a clear, concise visual image for the distinct differences, but it is hard to find it unless I manually spend 40 hours a week and draw them myself, which I would love to do. I'm just not sure I have time to do that right now, but I think hopefully does that kind of maybe answer some of your questions?
Yes, definitely. Thank
Okay,
you.
good. Yeah. And then I think Valerie, there was somebody else had another question.
Yes.
Okay.
Our next question, are there guidelines that should be followed for classically designed contemporary residential houses in regards to which orders should be used, or is it all based on architect and client preference?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Well, the thing about is clients, I'm sure there's some clients in lecture today. I mean, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but you know, a lot of clients don't really know the proper orders, or they're simply looking at and appreciating it based on observation. What I would do is, as a designer, as an architect, I would go and look at this. I think I mentioned it's called the American Vignola, William Ware. He's one of the few people that simplified how to properly draw, construct, and appreciate the orders, because there are hundreds of books and charts and diagrams on how to properly design and proportion these. But that book is kind of a guideline for architects, artists, engineers, contractors, builders, that is easy to follow. His name is William Ware. He's considered the American Vignola because Vignola was the architect that sort of codified and simplified a lot of the orders into a guidebook that designers and architects can follow. So I would look at, it's called the American Vignola. And I think everyone, you know, you should show that to your clients as a designer and architect to show this is really how the classical order should be sized and proportioned and constructed. It's a very simple diagrammatic book to show how there's the relationship of the parts are mixed together, because there's so many. If you look at Palladius' book of architecture, you're not going to be able to understand how to properly draw that. So the William Ware book actually made it simple for any sort of, I think, layperson, artist, designer to kind of understand and follow how the orders are supposed to be really proportioned based on the size of the architrave, the frieze, the cornice. So I would definitely look at that.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Well, we have about 15 more minutes. Do you guys have any questions or some other slides you'd like me to go through? And I hope you guys are taking notes on some of this. It's important. I know to get credit, it's good to commit these to visual memory. Valerie, are there any other questions or comments?
No questions at the moment, but are there any pages that you guys would like to go back to possibly take notes of? And then we'll be sending these notes out as well, right, Jay?
Yes. Yes, I have a PDF for each lecture.
I do have one housekeeping thing. If you are logged in as Blue Logic, can you please change to your name so I can make sure you get credit? Thank you so much.
Sure.
I have a question, another question about the Pantheon. You're talking about how the columns are a single piece. Did I understand
Yes.
that correctly?
Yes, uh-huh.
Is that was that a particularly Roman characteristic, or did the Greeks also do that, where they had one piece for an entire column?
You know, that is a good question. I'm not sure. When I look at, Greek, like for example, when I look at Greek temples, these are definitely Greek temples. You can see that all the parts are made into individual pieces. I'm not sure that, I think by this time, I think this is Temple of Hera, probably 600 BC. I think they're using local stone. But I think in the Roman societies, these are for some reason imported from Egypt. And I don't think the Egyptians made columns in individual pieces the same way that they constructed obelisks. I really don't know why. I mean, you would think that it would be so much easier to construct the columns like this. But I think by this time, the Romans were trying to perfect the orders that the Greeks established. So they probably wanted to see their structural and craftsmanship capabilities by the first century. So maybe they wanted a completely smooth interrupted column just for what I'm calling shock value in architecture. But yeah, I'm not sure why that is. Mhm. And well, I guess part of this is I think this might have been porphyry marble, which is very, very hard. It probably is difficult for them to cut in individual sections. But there again, to make this, curved column with, the tapering, they'd have to carve this out of a solid square rectangular block. So I'm really not sure why. Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. Yeah, I guess if there aren't any questions, I just find this diagram really amazing to think that, yeah, I mean, look at the detail in painting this. Not gold paint, but gold leafed and painted. Not only that, but there is bead and reel carvings in each segment of the little folds on the scrolls. And this is just one. You can imagine all of these columns would have been painted like that. It would have taken them years to start and finish a building. I'm still baffled by the construction methods back then. But anyway, that's part of history. And after the stuff they can build without power tools, I can completely believe that. Of course, a lot of people think that Rome and Greece is built with nothing but stone and marble, but really there is wooden scaffolding everywhere to build something. They would have had to fall a million trees to get some of these buildings constructed. And also, it's, to think that with possibly a compass, a string, and a triangle and pencil, you can take this and build something like this without a computer, without laser technology. They were the master builders. Especially, I mean, for this sculptor to take this and interpret it as this. I mean, yeah, I think Bernini and the Baroque would probably have trouble doing this. Of course, he was so skilled, but Bernini is 1500s, 1560 AD. Callimachus was 500 BC. It's really wonderful to think there's a story behind the creation origins, what normally looks like a very overdone capital. Now there's a story behind the way these are created. I mean, look at just the leaves carved out of a solid block of stone or marble is just unbelievable to me that can actually be done. Okay, well, I think, Valerie, we have about 10 more minutes. Hopefully you guys are, I try not to make the lecture boring. I can give you an hour of terms and term, which, is important, but I think by showing photographs and examples, I think it makes the class a little more interesting and believable, because when I was a student, I saw these, I thought, there's no way people built stuff like that. But then you look at the photographs and think, wow, these actually were constructed, with primitive tools.
We have another fun question.
Okay.
Since classical architecture is all about proportion, are the steps that lead up to the temple also designed with the rules of proportion?
Excellent question. Let's take a look at, this is a facade or an elevation of the Pantheon. You're saying the base of the building?
The steps leading up to it, yes.
Okay, you can sort of see the steps. The only rule that I remember from history of course, in ancient Greek temples is there's a rule of threes. You can see threes, there's 3 beams, and the triglyphs, there's 3 steps, probably because the ancient Greece said that 2 steps were too few, 4 steps were too many, 3 was just perfect. So when you look at the ancient, temples, there's really 3 steps up to the temple. And this is not the best picture, but I think you can probably see 1, 2, 3 steps for the plinth. Let's go back to, then of course, I contradict myself. This is probably 7 or 8 steps, but of course, this is before the architectural proportion was perfected in the Acropolis 300 years later. But I think I'm not sure if there's a specific rule in that, but that's a good question. I just remember that really funny poetic rule about the reason how the Parthenon in Greece determined, let me go back, the number of steps. You would think that there's a very specific ratio because everything in the world they did was very carefully done. There's really 3 steps based on 2's too little, 4's too many, 3's just perfect.
So this is Raphael again from Houston.
Yes. Yeah.
You had mentioned the Corinthian capital with the acanthus leaves. Did you say that there was examples of a way to do Corinthian without the acanthus leaves, with a more simple capital, or did I hear that wrong?
No, I think, can you see the image on the board right now, the computer?
Yeah.
No, there really isn't one. What they're showing is on the left is showing just the basic proportions of the size of the capital, but nobody really constructed the Corinthian capital without the leaves. But yeah, so I don't think I said that. I think it's really, the Corinthian capital does show the acanthus leaves.
Okay.
I'm going to show you one example, and let me change my. There are of course exceptions for every rule. That's what makes architecture interesting and somewhat contradictory. But let me see if I can find that. Hold on just a minute. Okay, let me change my screen around and Okay, can you see this image, the Ionic Capital?
Yes.
Can you see the capital before that?
You mean below that, or?
Yeah, well, there's actually two. The Ionic Capital is above that. There's one I was going to give in the lecture next week, but it's called the Temple of the Winds. Now, the Temple of the Winds is kind of a separate Greek temple. It actually, you'll have to look that. I don't have an image of that, but really, it's the very simplest Corinthian order, which I haven't really discussed because they have lotus leaves and just one layer of Corinthian acanthus leaves. It's technically the next simplest order next to Tuscan. I don't know if that answered your question, but really the Corinthian order does have some aspect of acanthus leaves for the order.
Okay, very good. Thank
Of
you.
course, these are carved in wood. Yeah. Okay, I think, Val, I think we have about 5 more minutes. We still have plenty of time to answer questions. Then I think, Valerie, what I'd like to do is if we can get a survey of some of the students, if they want me to show them how to do drawing tutorials, because we're actually going to be doing drawing classes in June. And so, but I'm happy to do, show the students how to draw anything that they want. It just depends on if there's an interest for that.
Hey, I'm so sorry, Jay. I got a call from Brad Kelly actually, but I don't know if you were able to grab Carolyn's last thing. Did domestic architecture follow the classic proportions such as height and width of facades, doorways, etc.?
The domestic, yes,
Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
definitely, yeah. I'm seeing if there's any other questions.
Okay, I've got 1 o'clock.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks everyone for participating. And Valerie, I think we can regroup and I'll send everyone the PDF file of the lecture and I'll see you next Tuesday.
Oh, and we got one more question. What do you feel brought about the end of teaching classical proportion to architects?
Well, what do I feel? Say it again.
What do you feel brought about the end of teaching classical proportion to architects?
Many different factors. That is a good question. I had to think about that. I think, well, roughly, during the 1950s and 60s, there was a trend to get away from classical styles as a way of just, because modernism was the new sort of regime. And so I think they were just getting away from that just for aesthetic reasons. But, but by the time, I think what I said earlier in a couple of lectures is that really before around 1940 is that contractors and builders knew how to actually build the classical orders without having to rely on hundreds of drawings because they were trained in a mason to actually do that. I think it was really the advent of mid-century modernism that sort of got away from getting from historical classical styles. Because if you look at, residential architecture in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there wasn't a lot of classical architecture being built, not definitely to the capacity I'm seeing now. So I think it was just a stylistic trend. I give architecture walking tours in downtown Dallas, and we look at these incredible hotel lobbies that were built in the 1920s. And what they've done is during postmodernism, during stylistic trends, fads, they rip out the classical orders as a way of completely eradicating classicism in history, and they'll cover it up with laminates and formica because that was popular back then, which I think is just a shame. They didn't just cover it up, they removed it as a way of removing it from your entire classical history. I think it was really just based on a stylistic trend to enter modernism and get away from classical architecture altogether. I think that's really disturbing, but that's of course kind of the way it was. If you look at American cities, Houston, Austin, especially Dallas, is that if you look at old photographs versus 1920s versus 1940s and 50s, is that they started covering up the classical pilasters with aluminum and marble panels as a way of streamlining and modernizing the buildings, even if it meant sacrificing the classical orders. But now, they're bringing things back to life, which I think is just extraordinary. I'm surprised and disheartened that people actually used to do that. If you think about, classical architecture during the Renaissance in Rome, they would remove classical entablatures an entirely marble order just to build other buildings. They would remove the bronze from the dome and the Pantheon to make other buildings. Architects are, it's just amazing to think, what they did with the original classicism during the 50s and 60s, but that's part of history. That's my take on it. But
Thank you.
sure, you're welcome. Okay, everyone, thanks. I will see you next Tuesday. And Valerie, thanks again for this wonderful teaching experience.
No, thank you so much. We'll see you guys next week.
Okay, bye-bye.